Now, church, when you're really thirsty, you're not super picky about the water you drink. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I remember growing up, we used to always drink from the garden hose. Do I have any former hose drinkers out there? Oh my goodness, right? We're still going, right? I mean, now think back about this for a moment. I didn't really know how clean that hose was. Like, I know the hose at my house got thrown around outside in the garage, got stored in weird places. Like, the hose was probably older than I even was. And yet, I didn't really give any second thought to kind of what junk was in or on that hose. I drank from it because it was hot outside and I was thirsty, right? Hindsight, maybe I should have just gone inside and got some water. But we're still here, praise God. You see, your level of thirst dictates how lax you are about your source of water. When you're super thirsty, you'll drink almost anything to quench your great thirst. And I feel like that's a really appropriate analogy for our lives. Like, church, you may not know this, but we, mankind, we're thirsty. We're a thirsty people. Thirsty for meaning and purpose. Thirsty to understand our existence and live lives that matter. And I think we're made all the more thirsty because of what we talked about last week. You see, last week in Ecclesiastes, we look at the harsh realities of injustice, wickedness, and oppressions of life, that these things, coupled with the inevitability of death, make life really, really hard to understand and walk through. I think that makes us thirst all the more for answers, for purpose, for meaning, for relief, for help in understanding life under the sun. And so, church, where do we run with our great thirst? Like, where do we go to try and find satisfaction in the midst of vain, oppressive, unjust existence? Where do we go? Well, I think, church, too often, we go to dirty wells. That's where we go. See that? We're going to be in Ecclesiastes 4 this morning. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. We'll have it up on the screen as well. We're going to be Ecclesiastes 4 through 16. So if you could stand with me as we honor the reading of God's word this morning. I'm going to read for us our text, Ecclesiastes 4 through 16. It says this: Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and the striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after the wind. Again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has no one, not another, to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from the prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and the striving after wind. Amen. You could be seated. Now, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, the preacher has been making observations about life under the sun. You see that in our text, right? It says, I saw, and then I saw. He's observing, he's considering, he's collecting data. What does man pursue? What does he run to? Where does he go to quench his thirst for meaning and purpose in life? And maybe even, where does he go to cope with the hardships of life? Now, that word cope, you often hear cope not by itself. You hear it kind of with that other word. We talk about coping mechanisms a lot. Have you guys heard that term? A coping mechanism, right? A coping mechanism is something that we use to try and deal with stress. Something we run to when we thirst for relief from the hardships of life under the sun. And so I just looked up a few of these. I looked up the 10 most common negative coping mechanisms in our world today. It includes things like substance abuse, avoidance and denial, self-harm, negative self-talk, binge eating, isolation, procrastination, overwork, aggression, and of course, excessive screen time. And maybe in that list, you see your propensity to run to some of these things when life gets tough. And what the preacher, he's going to show us here today is that these things that we go to help us cope with the hardships of life, those things, they're really polluted and dirty, and they're ultimately not going to help you cope. They're going to let you down when you need them the most. So the first thing we see, or the first well that we look at, is the well of work. Look at verse 4 with me. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. That's that question, why do we work? Why do we expend ourselves at our jobs? What the preacher's going to say here is when you dig deep into the motivations of that, what he finds is that many of us work hard simply because of envy. We envy our neighbor. We envy his position, his title, his money, his possessions. I like what Dr. Warren Wiersbe says, and he says, the purpose of their work was not to produce beautiful or useful products or to help people, but to stay ahead of the competition and survive in the battle for bread. You see, church, work was ultimately given to us by God so that we would cultivate, so we would create, so that we would work for the flourishing of God's creation. But the preacher says that mankind, what we've done is we've twisted this. The work no longer is about helpful production, but instead it's more marked by selfish envy. That I've got to work hard because I have to beat out that guy. Because if he works harder than I do, he's going to get the promotion, or he's going to keep the job and I might lose mine. Or I have to post more things online because I have to get more social media followers than that person there to give my life validation and meaning. That I need to amass more wealth than my neighbor because his truck's better than mine and that doesn't sit well with me. And what happens, church, is when envy is motivating us at work, overwork will naturally follow. And again, that word overwork, we saw that in that list of top 10 negative coping mechanisms. Didn't we see it? Overwork. We throw ourselves at overwork. And at first glance, that's a really strange thing to do, isn't it? Like, if you're stressed out, why would you go and do more work? Like, that doesn't really compute. Why do we do that, church? Well, I think sin gets us all twisted up and confused about this. We're stressed out by work, but because we're so envious of others, we can't help but overwork, thinking somehow our overwork will one day relieve our stress. It's a vicious cycle, but one that we run to over and over again. And the reason I think we keep running there, church, is I think we've bought into the lie that somehow wealth and money, maybe, just maybe, can make the oppressions and hardships of life go away. Like, have you ever thought that for a moment? If I just had a little bit more money right now, this wouldn't be an issue. Former U.S. politician Claire Booth Lewis said it like this: money can't buy happiness, but it can make you awfully comfortable while you're being miserable. And I think that's what many of us believe. We drink at that well, envious overwork to try and scrape out just a little more comfort amidst a hard life. And what happens, church, is when we don't catch this, when we don't realize how dangerous overwork can be as a coping mechanism, it becomes, as what Dr. Wiersbe notes, a fixation. We move from just simply overwork to a fixation with our work. Look at verses 7 and 8 in our text. Again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there's no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is a vanity and an unhappy business. This right here, church, this is the fruit of a life unchecked by envious overwork in the pursuit of wealth. See that phrase in verse 7? It says, one person who has no other. It's kind of a strange Hebrew phrase, but the phrase in Hebrew literally says this: one is alone, there is no second. Makes you think of that one is the loneliest number, right? It is. There's no spouse, no brother, no son, no friend. This person has sprinted so far ahead in his envious overwork that when he actually takes a moment to look around, there's no one else there. When mankind drinks from the well of overwork, what will happen is he might get more wealth, but we see he's never satisfied. And it's going to ruin his life in the end. Driven to try and escape the hardships of life with just a little bit more money and yet all alone. But just as we saw in verse 4, the preacher, he comes to the same conclusion in verse 8, that this lifestyle is vanity, church. By love, he doesn't just say vanity. He says it's also an unhappy business. That's an unhappy life. We think if I just keep working hard and just get a little bit more, then it will be happy. But he says that's an unhappy life. There's no fruit there, church. It's not a well worth drinking from for our great thirst. But envious overwork isn't the only way that we're prone to abuse the God-given toil he's given us. We can also neglect it and become lazy. Look at verse 5. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. This little proverb here, the idea of folding your hands means just kind of relaxing. Taking a little bit more time to chill out instead of actually pressing into the toil you need to do. And it makes sense, right? If life is hard, then you die. Why put in too much effort? I mean, let's be honest. We should just do the minimum amount of work. Don't try too hard. Chase comfort and ease because, let's be honest, C's get degrees, don't they? We don't need an A or a B. Who cares about A's and B's? C's are what get degrees. Let's just focus there. Now notice, this isn't just vanity, according to the preacher. He doesn't say anything about vanity here. What does he say? This is foolishness. This is straight up foolishness. This is unwise living because what he says is ultimately when you are lazy, who does it hurt? It hurts yourself. You eat your own flesh. We injure ourselves when we approach life with a minimalistic, lazy bent. Again, church, I love when science proves these realities out. I mean, you've seen it. Physical harm related to laziness, obesity, blood pressure, heart problems. I mean, there's report after report about the physical toll that a lazy lifestyle has on your body. But they're coming out with more, church. It's not just the physical toll. There's a mental toll, the mental health toll of people that are lazy, the social and emotional harm it causes. A lazy lifestyle is littered with pain. I think you guys know this. We know this. We've heard the stories. We've read the reports. We know these things, that laziness isn't good for us. And yet, we still think it looks pretty good. We still think, you know what? I still think I'd rather have that. We think it's a cure for the hectic pace of life we live on. But then, if it's a cure, we can't call it laziness, right, church? Because laziness is way too negative of a term. We got to dress it up a little bit. Comfortable, restful, at ease, relaxed. Even times we throw biblical concepts out there like contentment when we're really just talking about being lazy. You see us all the time when we say, how was your weekend? Oh man, I had a great weekend. It's just really restful. I just felt like I needed some me time. So I just really tried to be content with things and just took some downtime for me to rest and recoup from a busy week. Well, that sounds great, right? The reality is, what did I do? I laid on my couch all day, ate junk food, and watched videos and played video games. That's not restful, that's just lazy. But we can dress it up, can't we? Rest, relaxation, contentment are good things, church. I think one thing we often lack in the press of overwork in our society is a proper Sabbath and rest. But let's not mix those things up. Some of us are not good at resting, we're just really lazy. And again, I get it. Life is hard, oppressive, unjust. And not only that, life has a lot of demands. And in that space, we get tired. We get worn out. Life beats us down. And so what do? We veg. We play video games for hours on end. We take so many naps that they can't really be qualified as naps anymore. We stream movies, shows, and clips into the wee hours of the night, all under the excuse that I am so tired and worn out, I just need to veg a bit. I just need a little bit of downtime to cope with the hardships of life. But church, what we see here is the well of laziness is a foolish life. It doesn't help us in our hurt or confusion. In fact, it harms us more. And that's the difficulty we live in with this well of work. When we run to work for our satisfaction, we tend to swing to these extremes of overwork. And then what happens? We burn out and we swing to the other extreme of laziness. We just never can quite get it right. There has to be something better. Look at verse 6. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after the wind. The preacher gives us this proverb here basically to teach us a healthy balance between the extremes of overwork and laziness. Notice there, it doesn't say no handfuls, because that's kind of silly, but no handfuls would represent laziness. You just folded your hands. There's nothing for you to do there. My hands are folded, so I'm just lazy. But he says the opposite. 2 handfuls are overwork. I'm doing too much. It's a 1 handful life that's of proper balance, that we're trying to find this proper work-life balance. So we get rest, work, play, all perfectly kind of ordered in a way that's good for our lives and for his glory. And church, we need to wrestle through this. We need to look at our lives and examine if we're drifting more towards overwork or more towards laziness. Because neither of those things are going to satisfy you, church. When life gets hard and you're trying to navigate the difficulties of life, when you're just drifting towards laziness or overwork, it's not going to help you. But church, I'm going to press a little harder here, because even if you hit that proper balance, you look at your life and you're like, man, I've got perfect work-life balance. None of us do, but maybe you do. It's still not going to be enough to cope. Because work was never meant to help you cope with the meaningless of life. That's not what it was. Toil and work, they are God-given parts of our existence, but they're not meant to satisfy our thirsty souls. We need something more, church. But the second place we often run to is the well of independence and individualism. We just looked at verses 7 through 8 in our text, and we saw this loner, right? This guy that there was one and had no other. He was so bent on pursuing riches, he looked around and had no one else around. And so to this guy, and any of those in our room that think a life of lone ranging will satisfy, the preacher gives us this warning in verses 9 through 12. He says, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. Like, church, I think we know this. Like, we know life is better together, don't we? We know we need each other. We know God said in Genesis 2 that it is not good for man to be alone. But I think sometimes we forget. Maybe forget's not the right word. Maybe I think we choose to forget. We choose to forget and try to cope with the hardships of life. How? In isolation. Remember that top 10 negative coping mechanisms? Again, we saw isolation there. Why do we do this, church? Like, why do we run to the well of isolation, independence, individualism when life is hard, when life hurts? Well, church, I think we do this because one of the main things that makes life so hard is people. People makes life hard. I don't remember if it was here or somewhere else, but when I first became a pastor, I got this advice, okay? This is what I was told. Pastoring would be easy if it weren't for all the people. I don't know if that was you guys or someone else out there. Pastoring would be really easy if it weren't for all the people. And I think what happens is, church, some of us live this way, don't we? We live this way thinking that if we approach our jobs or our lives like this, life will be a little bit easier, right? And so my coworkers can't stress me out if I never talk to them. Like friends IRL, for those of you that don't know, that means in real life. Friends in real life, they're too much effort. That's too hard. I'm going to stick to the digital friends because I can just delete, gone, right? We isolate ourselves, build our happy little kingdoms, and live out our days in peace. And nowhere can I think of a greater example of this than the garage door. I mean, think about how isolating the garage door is. Because what I do is I go say bye to my family. I get in my car, garage door closed, start my car, garage door goes up, back out my car, go to work. Do my thing at work, drive home. There's my neighbor. Nope, go into the garage door. Garage door goes down. Never have to say a word to anyone. And Americans, we love our garage doors, don't we? We love them. Because then we never have to talk to someone and get invested in their lives or hear about their junk or have them influence us in any ways we don't want. But as much as we may have perfected the pursuit of individualism and independence in our society, church, you need to understand these wells have been well dug. This isn't a new thing. You see, I think sometimes we think we're the first, but if you think about this, isn't it really interesting here in our text that the preacher felt compelled enough about this issue of isolation, individualism, independence, to write these words right here to a very collective Jewish society? We think, oh, they don't struggle with this, right? They're collective. We're the ones that struggle with this. I actually found a really fascinating article during my research titled "The Rise of Individualism Among the Hebrews" by a guy named J.M. Powys Smith from the 1800s. I don't know anything else about him, but his premise is that when the Jewish people became land-owning and moved away from their nomadic lifestyle, there may have been an opportunity for them to shift towards more individualism and independence, right? They didn't feel like they needed each other as much because they had their own space now to live in. And what that tells me, church, why I share that with you this morning, is I want you to remember individualism, independence, isolation, these aren't particularly American issues. I think sometimes we think we're the forerunners of this, right? Americans created independence. We made up individualism. I get that because it's so prevalent here. It's so intertwined with our society. But the truth is, even among the most collective societies on earth, there is still a hint of individualism and independence because the human heart is so bent towards the love of self. That's what's going on here. You see, church, when we live our life this way, life is hard, then you die. So what should you do? Build your life on you. Do what feels good to you. Don't worry about others. Just take care of what's best for you and your family. And church, that is a selfish, self-focused, and yet all too common life that people pursue today. That people think, hey, if I live this way, it's going to alleviate my burdens or give my life the greatest amount of meaning and pleasure. But what the preacher shares in this section here is the reality of, church, we badly need each other. Even as difficult as we are, we need each other. Look at the 4 things he says. Number 1, he says working together is more productive. Do you see that there? I know it often feels like you can work better on your own, but that's just not true. They've actually done a study of this with animals. Maybe you've heard this. They put one oxen on a yoke and he pulled it 1,000 strength, right? So they thought, hey, we'll put another oxen on the yoke and it's going to be 2,000, right? Because 1,000, 1,000, 2,000. But then they put the oxen together. Do you know what they found? It was like 22 or 2,500. That both of them pulled harder. They were more productive when they what? When they worked together. Guess what? We're the same, guys. God created us in such a way that our work productivity increases when we work together well with others. Your individualistic work pursuits are actually taking you more time and effort than if you actually worked with others. But then he says also that we need each other because others can help us when we have a problem, right? That the independent life seems awesome until you need help. I think of this particularly, he uses that term falling there in our text. You see that? If you're older and you live by yourself, that's a real concern. Like I've got a grandfather, he's 94, he lives in a care facility now, but he lived by himself for a time. And if he would have fallen while he lived by himself, that would have been a big deal, right? If you fall and you're older and you have no one to help you, you could be in serious trouble. You see, when you're in a situation when you need help, and even young people, you're going to need help. You're not impervious to the things of life. Having no one around to help you can cost you dearly. Again, it's our arrogance and our pride that we think, you know what, I don't need other people, I got this. I can take care of myself, I can solve all the issues. You need others when you fall. But not only that, he also says we can provide for each other. Notice that image of needing to keep warm. It could possibly be an allusion to marriage, but more likely it's referring to travelers on the road at night. That these people in the ancient world, they literally needed each other to stay warm. To be caught outside in the cold of night on your own meant certain death. The only way to keep warm was through the provision of another person. And the last thing he says is that we're actually stronger and safer together. If you know anything about ancient Israel, the towns and the cities were a little bit more safer. When you went out into the country, it was a dangerous place. To walk from a city to a city on your own was to take your life in your hands. And so what people would do is they would travel together. There was safety in numbers. I mean, these all sound like really good things, don't they? Like, I don't know about you, I want more productivity. I want more help. I want more safety. I want more warmth. I want these things in my life. But they're not free. They come at a cost. Scholar Derek Kidner says, its obvious price is a person's independence. Henceforth, he must consult another's interest and convenience, listen to another's reasoning, adjust to another's pace and style, keep faith with another's trust. Church, are we willing to give up some of our independence and individualistic pursuits so that we can do life deeply with one another? Like, I mean, the preacher makes the benefits clear here. We know it's better for us, but are we willing to do that? I know independence and individualism, they may be the hallmarks of our society. They may be something that you and I are more culturally conditioned to pursue. They may even seem like a good life because, man, people are difficult. But in the end, individualism, isolation, independence fail us every time. They leave us vulnerable, weak, and still hurting in the face of our oppressors. And church, again, side note here, this is why we really push church attendance here at the church. Guys, I don't get bonus points up in heaven because you're here. God's not being like, oh, we topped 100. Okay, he gets another check mark, gets a better 401k in heaven. That's not how that works, guys. We push this here because of this reality right here. We need each other. It is arrogance and folly to think you can just Lone Ranger your Christian life. You're going to fall apart if that's what you do. And so we need to prioritize time together, Sunday morning, small groups, that we're doing life deeply because of the desperation we have to be with one another for our good. But the last well we see people drink from is that of popularity, position, and prestige. Look at verses 13 through 16 with me. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from the prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end to all of the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. The preacher closes our section with this story of two kings. The first king was an old and foolish king who no longer could take advice. If you look at verse 14, scholar Dwayne Garrett actually sees verse 14 describing the old king. That's the way he interprets this text. That verse 14 gives us the old king's background, that he had been poor and he had been in prison, but he worked himself up to that kingship, that he got the accolades and the following. Verse 15 says that everyone under the sun followed him. But at some point, this old king became stubborn, arrogant, and unable to take advice. And in that space, he became an old, foolish king who would one day be replaced. But there's a second king here. Do you see that? The second king is that poor and wise youth. Now, Dr. Warren Wiersbe actually thinks verse 14 is about him. So what he says, that even though this youth had one day been poor and was in prison, he would one day become king. Look at verse 15. The wise and young youth would one day take the king's place. Do you see that? So I've got two kings there. This guy became popular. Look at verse 16. All followed him. And so if we read this story, and we stop here, we can think this is just another admonition in Ecclesiastes of wisdom over foolish living, right? Again, that's a theme throughout the book, and I think it's one we need to hear. Wisdom and poverty are greater than riches and foolishness. You see this with our celebrities in our society today. But then this hammer drops in verse 16. Look at verse 16 with me. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Even that wise youth, at some point, is going to be left behind. In the end, neither the foolish or the wise king will be rejoiced in. People are going to move on, even though at one point there was no end to the people they led. And what this little story reminds us of, it reminds us of the fleeting nature of popularity, position, and prestige. Oliver Cromwell, when speaking about the cheering crowds after he had helped establish the Commonwealth of England, said to his friend standing with him, "Do not trust to the cheering, For those persons would shout as much if you and I were going to be hanged. Popularity is a really fickle thing, church. I mean, Jesus himself experienced this, did he not? At his triumphal entry, the crowd shouted, Hosanna! Here comes the king! And a few days later, what did they shout? Crucify him. And yet, we know this, but we still run to this well, don't we? I mean, if independence and individualism, if that doesn't work, maybe the opposite's what I need. I need crowds, I need followers, I need the masses. If a threefold cord is not quickly broken, man, let's make it 1 or 2K, right? 1,000-fold cord, a 2,000-fold cord, that's going to be really strong. That will give my life meaning or help me deal with the hardships I face. I'm just going to chase popularity, position, prestige. I want people to like me. I want people to respect my position. I want people to hold me in high regard. And again, so many people give their lives to this pursuit, thinking that becoming popular will help them cope with the hardships of life. But guys, people-pleasing is very unstable. It's very unstable. Because as easy as it is to get the crowds, the applause, the acclaim, it is so much easier to lose them just like that. With how fickle and unstable popularity is, why would we make this a life pursuit? Why would we run to this thinking, this is what I want, this is what's going to give my life meaning? Again, that's what he says in verse 16. Look back at verse 16. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. If you look at the preacher's conclusion about each of these points, that's what he said. He says, each one of these pursuits, church, they're vanity. Remember that word? It means like smoke-like, vapor. You try to grab onto these things to give your life meaning and purpose and hope, and they slip through your fingers because they're not solid. They're not able to give you the life you're looking for. They're dirty wells, broken and unable to help us navigate the complexity of a world stained with sin, brokenness, oppression, and injustice. Again, work isn't a bad thing, church. But when it's abused or neglected or we use it to try to fill our souls, it's not going to work. I mean, God did make each of us as individuals distinctly gifted and special in our own way. But when we try to focus on our individualism and independence, what happens is we end up pushing everyone away. We find ourselves isolated and alone, not living the life God created us to live. And it's not bad to be well-liked, but we need to be really careful. Luke 6:26 doesn't become true of us. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to the false prophets. I think about your life this morning, church. Where do you run? Like when the hardships of life start to overwhelm you, when you've just had a cruddy week and everything's crushing down on you, where do you run? Do you run to any of these dirty wells today? Is that where you go to cope? Or maybe you go to those top 10 coping mechanisms we talked about earlier. That's where you run. Maybe you've got your own dirty garden hose that you run to with your stress, oppression, and hard life. Is it food, entertainment, list making, Google? Where do you run? Like, think about it. What's the first thing you do when life gets hard? That's where you run. And where do you run isn't the question we should be asking, though. The question is, where should you run? Where should you run? That's our last point today. We should run to the well that we really long for. In John 4 and 6, we come across two stories of people looking for answers, looking for something to run to for their hardships and pain, something to provide for their needs. In John 4, it's a woman from Samaria. The Samaritans and the Jews, they're kind of enemies. They didn't get along. But this lady came to drew water in the middle of the day. That's not a common practice. She most likely did this to avoid people because she was living a lifestyle that other people would talk about and look at and judge. She'd had 5 husbands and was living with some new guy. She most likely was hurting, experienced shame for the sinful lifestyle she was in. She was in need. And if you go to John 6, you meet this other group. It's a crowd of people. They had seen Jesus heal the sick. Maybe some of them themselves had been sick and been healed. And then they got hungry. And what did Jesus do? He miraculously fed them. He took 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, and he fed thousands. But we get to John 6, and what happens? They're hungry again. I mean, maybe food was scarce. Maybe they were just scraping by. Maybe they couldn't make ends meet. They had a rationale for why they needed more bread. They were in need. And look how Jesus responds to both the woman and the crowds. In John 4:14, the woman, he says this, "But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." You see what Jesus is saying? He's saying to the woman, that water you drink, those things you're chasing over there, they're going to leave you thirsty again. But I have water that will satisfy your deepest longings, needs, and hurts. And to the crowds in John 6:35, he says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Again, to the crowds, he says, that bread you think you need, it's not going to satisfy. You're going to be hungry again. That well you go to, it's going to leave you needing more and more and more. You need the bread of life. You need something that's going to satisfy you, not just today, but for forever. Church, Jesus is the well our souls need. He is what we long for. He is what we really thirst for when things go wrong. When life is hard, when we're stressed out, when we're confronted with injustice and oppression, when life doesn't make sense. I'm talking to church folk here today. So I think most of you intellectually get this, right? All of you here would say, yeah, Jesus is the well. Praise God. But then why do we still run to other wells? Like, I get this intellectually, but then we drift towards these other places to cope. We run to food when our heart breaks instead of Jesus. We run to overwork when we have marital stress instead of Jesus. We run to isolation when conflict arises instead of Jesus. Church, what are we doing? He's the bread of life. He's the living water. He's going to help us not to hunger or thirst when we come to him. And so that's my encouragement as we close this morning, church. Run to Jesus. Like when your life is hard, when things don't make sense, when the injustices of life feel way too heavy for you to bear today. You just read the news and you saw another terrible story. Go to Jesus. Instead of going to food first, go to prayer first. Instead of going to Google and list making first, go to worship first. Instead of running to isolation or pleasure or entertainment, go to reading the gospel again. Church, there is no other fount that I know that can sustain, provide, heal, help, and bless in the face of the hardships of life. There's nothing but the blood of Jesus, church. And so this week, my encouragement, church, is would you take your hurts to him instead? Like, would you take your confusion, your insecurities, your hardships to him first this week, church? Not later. Not after you've done your other coping mechanisms and calmed down a bit, and then you go, okay, I should pray now. But would you go to him first? Would you run to the perfect well, the Son of God, the Alpha and the Omega, Jesus Christ, with all your pain and all your suffering this week? My prayer is that each of us would stop running to these other places. They might give us a quick fix and feel like, oh, that made my life feel a little bit better for a moment. But in the end, we're still going to be thirsty. We're still going to need something more for our souls. Only Jesus Christ can satisfy your great thirst. And life is just way too difficult to think you can find hope or healing out there. It's just not going to work. Every time you face something hard this week, church, run to Jesus and let him provide.